Hey guys, good afternoon. This is the Chapter 2 video lecture. I'm sorry, Chapter 3 video lecture. I'll be covering the cardiovascular system in a second. Okay, so let's start talking about the cardiorespiratory system and fitness. All right, so the cardiorespiratory fitness is defined in the book as the ability of the cardiovascular and respiratory systems to supply oxygen and nutrients to large muscle groups to sustain dynamic activity. Okay, so obviously the more capable you are of generating this system in terms of supplying oxygen to the muscles, then the more you're capable of doing. So the better fit you are. Okay. So in order to understand the cardiorespiratory system, I'm going to break it down into the two individual systems that make up the cardiorespiratory system, and that's the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system. All right. Now, each of those systems are distinct. They serve distinct purposes. However, they're interrelated, so we often, refer to them as a cardiorespiratory system, but it's not the the cardiorespiratory system is that interaction. But the cardiovascular system is totally separate, and the respiratory system is totally separate. It's just that there's a unique interaction between those two that, they kind of rely on each other. Okay. So the cardiovascular system, also known as the circulatory system because it circulates all the blood throughout the body, consists of the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood itself. So anything that affects those three systems, the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood, is called a cardiovascular disease. Okay, so a lot of people feel or think that cardiovascular disease is referring to the heart, and it does capture diseases of the heart, but it also captures diseases of the blood vessel and the blood itself. So cardiovascular disease can be anything. So when we talk about cardiovascular disease later on, we'll start identifying specific diseases that fall under that umbrella term. Okay, the respiratory system is also known as the pulmonary system. The pulmonary is in reference to the lungs. I think there's a Latin term for lungs is something regarding pulmonary. But if you hear of respiratory or pulmonary, it's the same system. And it consists of the air passageways in the lungs. So it doesn't sound like there's a lot going on with the respiratory system, but there are some chief characteristics that allows the respiratory system to function adequately. Okay. So again, the main function of the two systems is to deliver oxygen and nutrients to the tissues and organs. All right. So looking more closely at the cardiovascular system. So I'll start with the heart, and I mean that's I guess that's a good starting point. I'll get into details of the heart. So whenever in a second how it functions as a 4-chamber 2-pump system. But I'll discuss that in a second. Whenever the blood starts there, and whenever it's pumped out of the heart, it starts to navigate through. So whenever the blood leaves the heart, it's carried throughout the body through a network of blood vessels. All right, so we have different types of blood vessels. Any blood vessel that carries blood away from the heart is known as an artery. And almost every single artery in the body is carrying oxygen-rich blood, except for the artery that delivers blood to the lungs. That particular artery, known as the pulmonary artery, is carrying blood that's deprived of oxygen or is rich in carbon dioxide. And I'll explain that process in a second. And then you have blood vessels that return blood back to the heart. Those are known as the veins. Okay, and most veins in the body, with the exception of the pulmonary vein, which comes from the lungs, is carrying oxygen-deprived blood or blood that's rich in carbon dioxide. Okay. Now it states here that there's a third kind of blood vessel known as the capillaries, and the capillaries are a blood vessel, but before the capillaries, the arteries are broken down to smaller blood vessels known as arterioles, and those arterioles then break down into the capillaries. Now, the capillaries are very thin blood vessels. They're usually located in the beds of tissues, the muscles. They surround the organs, and surround the brain, and really they surround the cells. And so the thin walls of the capillaries allows for gas exchange. So blood that has oxygen, the oxygen in the blood then is transported via the capillaries into the cells, and then the carbon dioxide that's produced by the cells is then transported into the capillaries, and then the capillaries start to merge to form the venules, which are smaller veins, if you will. And then the venules merge together to form the veins, and that's how the blood circulates back to the heart. Okay. Several different types of blood cells, but for this course, we're going to focus primarily on red blood cells. Okay. All right. So the heart itself, as I mentioned earlier, is a 4-chamber, 2-pump system. All right. So the 4 chambers are the right atrium and the left atrium. You can see here the left atrium, and then you have the right ventricle and the left ventricle. So you have the 2 atria, which is plural, atrium singular. All right, so you have the 2 top chambers, those are the atria, and then you have the 2 bottom chambers, which are the ventricles. Okay, so that's a 4-chamber system. All right, so I also mentioned it's a 2-pump system. All right, so the 2 pumps is the 2 atria. So the first pump are the 2 atria contracting at the same time, and I'll explain why in a second. And then you have your 2 ventricles contracting at the same time just after the atria contract. All right, so the simultaneous contraction of the top chambers, those are 2 chambers, they contract at once, and then the 2 bottom chambers contract at once. Okay, so it's a 4-chamber, 2-pump system. All right, now the heart itself is located directly behind the sternum, tilted to the left and tilted slightly upward. It's about the size of the fist. Okay, so that's the heart. All right, so you can see here's a posterior view, or a view of the back side of the heart. Again, you have the right atrium and the left atrium. Those are the 2 atria on top. And then you have the right ventricle and the left ventricle. Those are the 2 chambers on the bottom. Okay. Now, to give you an idea of what the chambers look like inside the heart, here's an internal view of the heart. So again, you see the 2 chambers up top. These are the 2 atria, the right atrium and the left atrium, and then you have the 2 bottom chambers, the 2 ventricles. You have the right ventricle and the left ventricle. Okay. All right. So so the heart, whenever the heart pumps, it pumps blood outside of the heart. Okay. So so again, the heart is what we consider the starting point. And where it starts is whenever the blood from the entire body returns to the heart. Okay, so blood from the entire body returns and is dumped into the right atrium. So that's the first chamber. Okay, you can see here at the just above the right chamber, or the right atria. This is the superior vena cava, which is the one of the two largest veins in the body. And then just below the right atrium, you have the inferior vena cava, which is also one of the 2 largest veins in the body. So these 2 veins are the 2 largest veins in the body. All right, so the superior vena cava delivers blood, or it drains blood from the upper body, from the head, neck, and arms. Okay, all the way to the fingers. Okay, so that's the superior vena cava, and the inferior vena cava carries blood from the lower parts of the body. So anything below the heart. So anything in the abdominal area, through all the way down to the pinky toes. Okay. All right. So and then also dumping into the right atrium is blood from the heart itself, and I'll explain that process in a second. Okay. So all of the blood that's dumping into the right atrium is deoxygenated. The oxygen has already been stripped by all the tissues that needed oxygen. Okay, so again, blood is delivered to the tissues. The tissues pick up oxygen. They give up carbon dioxide, and all of the carbon dioxide rich blood is dumped into the right atrium. Okay, all right. I'll explain what's happening at the left atrium in a second, but just know for now that the two atria contract at the same time. So you have that first pump. All right, so the two atria contract at the same time. In the right atrium, the blood from the right atrium is then pushed or pumped into the right ventricle. Okay, and the same thing happens in the left atrium, but I'll explain that blood in a second. Okay. All right, so you had those two. The first contractions were the two atria contracting, and blood from the right atrium is pumped into the right ventricle. Okay. Shortly after, almost immediately after the two atria contract, the two ventricles contract. And at this point, the blood from the right ventricle, which was the same blood from the right atrium, so all of this is deoxygenated blood, is pumped out of the heart via the pulmonary artery. I mentioned earlier that this is the only artery in the body that carries deoxygenated blood away from the heart. Okay, so now this blood that was first dumped into the right atrium, then pumped into the right ventricle, has now exited the heart and is going towards the lungs. Okay, so that's where we are with the lungs. Okay, so to explain what happens at the lungs, let me briefly describe what's going on with the respiratory system. All right, so this is your air passageways and the lungs. So you have the nasal cavity and the oral cavity, which are the two ways that we can breathe in air. And really, the only purpose of breathing in air is to capture the oxygen that's in the atmosphere. All right, so if we were on the moon or on Mars or any other place, we wouldn't have the capacity. We would have the capacity to breathe, but we wouldn't have the capacity to uptake oxygen. And because we wouldn't be able to uptake oxygen,